upon the borders of Epping Forest, at a distance of about 12 miles from London, a house of public entertainment called the Maypole. The Maypole was really an old house, a very old house, perhaps as old as it claimed to be, and perhaps older. Its windows were old diamond pane lattices. Its floors were sunken and uneven. Its ceilings blackened by the hand of time and heavy with massive beams. The evening with which we have to do was neither a summer nor an autumn one, but the twilight of a day in March, when the wind howled dismally among the bare branches of the trees, and rumbling in the wide chimneys and driving the rain against the windows of the Maypole Inn, caused the landlord to prophesy that the night would certainly clear at 11 o'clock precisely, which, by a remarkable coincidence, was the hour at which he always closed his house. The name of him upon whom the spirit of prophecy thus descended was John Willett, a burly, large-headed man with a fat face. Mr. Willett walked slowly up to the window, flattened his fat nose against the cold glass, and shading his eyes that his sight might not be affected by the ruddy glow of the fire, looked abroad. "It'll clear at 11 o'clock, no sooner and no later, not before and not afterwards." "How do you make out that?" said a little man in the opposite corner. "The moon is past the full and she rises at 9. John looked sedately and solemnly at his questioner until he had brought his mind to bear upon the whole of his observation, and then made answer, in a tone which seemed to imply that the moon was peculiarly, can't say that, his business and nobody else's. "Never you mind about the moon. Don't you trouble yourself about her. You let the moon alone and I'll let you alone." John applied a light to his pipe and smoked in placid silence, now and then casting a sidelong look at a man wrapped in a loose riding coat with huge cuffs, ornamented with tarnished silver lace and large metal buttons, who sat apart from the regular frequenters of the house, and wearing a hat flapped over his face, which was still further shaded by the hand on which his forehead rested, looked unsociable enough. The stranger became restless, perhaps from the nature of his previous meditations, for as he changed his position and looked hastily around, he started to find himself the object of such keen regard, and darted an angry and suspicious glance at the fireside group. "Well," said the stranger. "Well, there was not much in well. It was not a long speech." "I thought you gave an order," said the landlord. The stranger took off his hat and disclosed the hard features of a man of 60 or thereabouts, much weather-beaten and worn by time, and the naturally harsh expression of which was not improved by a dark handkerchief which was bound tightly round his head, and, while it served the purpose of a wig, shaded his forehead and almost hid his eyebrows. If it were intended to conceal or divert attention from a deep gash now healed into an ugly seam, which when it was first inflicted must have laid bare his cheekbone, the object was but indifferently attained, for it could scarcely fail to be noted at a glance. His complexion was of a cadaverous hue, and he had a grisly, jagged beard of some 3 weeks' date. "A highwayman," whispered Tom Cobb to Parks the ranger. "Do you suppose highwaymen don't dress handsomer than that?" replied Parks. Meanwhile, the subject of their speculations had done due honor to the house by calling for some drink, which was promptly supplied by the landlord's son Joe, a broad-shouldered, strapping young fellow of 20, whom it pleased his father still to consider a little boy and to treat accordingly. Stretching out his hands to warm them by the blazing fire, the man turned his head towards the company, and after running his eye sharply over them, "What house is that which stands a mile or so from here?" "Public house," said the landlord with his usual deliberation. "Public house, father," exclaimed Joe. "He means the great house, the Warren, the old red brick house, sir, that stands in its own grounds." "Aye," said the stranger, "but my question related to the owner." The heir apparent to the Maypole pressed his finger on his lips and replied in a lower tone, The owner's name is Hairdale, Mr. Geoffrey Hairdale, and a worthy gentleman, too. Paying as little regard to his admonitory cough as to the significant gesture that had preceded it, the stranger pursued his questioning. I turned out of my way coming here and took the footpath that crosses the grounds. Who was the young lady that I saw entering a carriage? His daughter? Why, how should I know, honest man, replied Joe, contriving in the course of some arrangements about the hearth to advance close to his questioner and pluck him by the sleeve. I didn't see the young lady, you know. Whew, there's a wind again, and rain. Well, it is at night. Rough weather indeed, observed the strange man. You're used to it, said Joe, catching at anything which seemed to promise a diversion of the subject. Pretty well, returned the other. About the young lady. Has Mr. Hairdale a daughter? No, no, said the young fellow fretfully. He's a single gentleman. I ask a few questions, returned the traveler boldly, as any stranger may, and not unnaturally, about the inmates of a remarkable house in a neighborhood which is new to me, and you are as aghast and disturbed as if I were talking treason against King George. Perhaps you can tell me why, sir, for I am a stranger, and this is Greek to me. That, returned the landlord, a little brought down from his dignity by the stranger's surliness, is a Maypole story, and has been any time these 24 years. That story is Solomon Daisy's story. It belongs to the house, and nobody but Solomon Daisy has ever told it under this roof, or ever shall. The man glanced at the parish clerk, whose air of importance plainly betokened him to be the person referred to, and observing that he had taken his pipe from his lips after a very long whiff to keep it alight, gathered his large coat about him, and shrinking further back was almost lost in the gloom of the spacious chimney corner, except when the flame shot upward with a strong and sudden glare, and illumining his figure for a moment, seemed afterwards to cast it into deeper obscurity than before. By this flickering light, which made the old room with its heavy timbers and paneled walls look as if it were built of polished ebony, the wind roaring and howling without, now rattling the latch and creaking the hinges of the stout oaken door, and now driving at the casement as though it would beat it in. By this light, and under circumstances so auspicious, Solomon Daisy began his tale. It was Mr. Reuben Hairdale, Mr. Geoffrey's older brother. Here he came to a dead stop and made so long a pause that even John Willett grew impatient and asked why he did not proceed. Cobb, said Solomon Daisy, dropping his voice and feeling to the post office keeper. What day of the month is this? The 19th. Of March, said the clerk, bending forward. The 19th of March. That's very strange. It was Mr. Reuben Hairdale, Mr. Geoffrey's elder brother, that 22 years ago was the owner of the Warren. His lady was lately dead, and he was left with one child, the Miss Hairdale you have been inquiring about, who was then scarcely a year old. Mr. Hairdale left this place when his lady died, feeling it lonely-like, and went up to London, where he stopped some months. But finding that place as lonely as this, as I suppose and have always heard say, he suddenly came back again with his little girl to the Warren, bringing with him besides that day only 2 women servants, and his steward and a gardener. The rest stopped behind up in London and were to follow next day. It happened that that night an old gentleman who lived in Chigwell Row and had long been poorly, deceased, and an order came to me at 12:30 at night to go and toll the passing bell. There was a movement in the little group of listeners, sufficiently indicative of the strong repugnance any one of them would have felt to have turned out at such a time upon such an errand. The clerk left and understood it and pursued his theme accordingly. It was a dreary thing, especially as the gravedigger was laid up in his bed, from long working in a damp soil and sitting down to take his dinner on cold tombstones. And I was consequently under obligation to go alone, for it was too late to hope to get any other companion. I put as good a face upon it as I could, and muffling myself, for it was mortally cold, started out with a lighted lantern in one hand and a key of the church in the other. It was such a night as this, blowing a hurricane, raining heavily, and very dark. I often think now, darker than I ever saw it before or since. That may be my fancy, but the houses were all closed shut and the folks indoors, and perhaps there is only other man who knows how dark it really was. I got into the church, chained the door back so that it should keep ajar, and putting my lantern on the stone seat in the little corner where the bell rope is, sat down beside it to trim the candle. I sat down to trim the candle, and when I had done so, I could not persuade myself to get up again and go about my work. I don't know how it was, but I thought of all the ghost stories I had ever heard, even those that I had heard when I was a boy at school and forgotten long ago. I recollected one story, how that uncertain night in the year, it might be that very night for anything I knew, all the dead people came out of the ground and sat at the heads of their own graves till morning. This made me think how many people I had known were buried between the church door and the churchyard gate, and what a dreadful thing it would be to have to pass among them and know them again, so early and unlike themselves. I had known all the niches and arches in the church from a child. Still, I couldn't persuade myself that those were their natural shadows, which I saw on the pavement, but felt sure there were some ugly figures hiding among them and peeping out. Thinking on in this way, I began to think of the old gentleman who was just dead, and I could have sworn that I saw him in his usual place, wrapping his shroud about him and shivering as if he felt it cold. All this time I sat listening and hardly dared to breathe. At length I started up and took the bell rope in my hands. At that minute there rang, not that bell, for I had hardly touched the rope, but another. I heard the ringing of another bell, and a deep bell too, plainly. It was only for an instant, and even then the wind carried the sound away, but I heard it. I listened for a long time, but it rang no more. I had heard of corpse candles, and at last I persuaded myself that this must be the corpse bell tolling of itself at midnight for the dead. I tolled my bell. How long, I don't know, and ran home to bed as fast as I could touch the ground. I was up early next morning after a restless night and told the story to my neighbors. Some were serious and some made light of it. I don't think anybody believed it real. But that morning, Mr. Reuben Hairdale was found murdered in his bedchamber, and in his hand was a piece of the cord attached to an alarm bell outside the roof, which hung in his room and had been cut asunder, no doubt by the murderer when he seized it. That was the bell I heard. A bureau was found opened, and a cash box, which Mr. Hairdale had brought down that day, and was supposed to contain a large sum of money, was gone. The steward and gardener were both missing, and both suspected for a long time, but they were never found, though hunted far and wide. And far enough they might have looked for poor Mr. Rudge, the steward, whose body, scarcely to be recognized by his clothes and the watch and ring he wore, was found months afterwards at the bottom of a piece of water in the grounds, with a deep gash in the breast where he had been stabbed with a knife. He was only partly dressed, and the people all agreed that he had been sitting up reading in his own room, where there were many traces of blood, and was suddenly fallen upon and killed before his master. Everybody now knew that the gardener must be the murderer, and though he has never been heard of from that day to this, he will be, mark my words. The crime was committed this day, 22 years, on the 19th of March, 1753. On the 19th of March, in some year, no matter when. I know it. I am sure of it. For we have always, in some strange way or other, been brought back to the subject on that day ever since. On the 19th of March in some year, sooner or later, that man will be discovered.